There have been hundreds and hundreds, probably even thousands, of lost media searches that have been conducted since the beginning of the community. These differ in depth, scope, and range, but without a doubt are all important to the well-being and history of the greater scene. While I was not involved with lost media back when the website first opened in 2012, I was there in 2015, which was 10 years ago, to experience what the scene was like and what exactly searching for lost media was all about. And now a decade later, after having experienced so many different kinds of lost media searches and interactions with the community, I find myself thinking about these older times more often. So today I want to go back in time and talk about what my greatest searches were. And it's crazy to think about how much time has passed since some of these have been conducted. Some of my newer viewers might not even be familiar with these topics anymore. And I think next year I would like to spend more time talking about the culture and history of the community, since time is fading away the older memories, and there aren't even many veteran users still around from those early and mid-2010s days. But for this video, the topics will be organized in order from my least favorite to most favorite based on rank, and also discuss the impact they had on either the search process, the community, or my viewers as a whole, instead of simply summarizing the topic itself. These are my personal selections and not what I think are objectively the 5 best searches of all time, so that would have to be its own video, which I might do sometime. But with that said, let's get into the first topic. Coming in at number 5 on my list was actually the first lost media topic I ever looked into on my own, and that's none other than Kablam episode 29. Though this is a topic that I actually find myself forgetting about pretty frequently in the modern day, especially when recollecting searches from the past. It usually only gets brought up when someone asks me what got me into lost media or what my first search was. And I think that's for a good reason, because on the surface, it's actually not very memorable. The summary of this topic for those unaware is that it's supposedly a lost episode of the Nickelodeon cartoon of the same name that was going to air as the series finale, before it was halted from airing after the show was picked up for another season. So basically it's like a lost episode kind of situation. Users had claimed there was a famous kiss scene in this episode between the main characters, and that it became an incredibly desired piece of Nickelodeon content. Some people claimed it was never actually aired on TV, while others said it had limited airings or was only shown once. There was a very mixed consensus on its existence, and that's exactly what brought me into the topic. How could someone not know if an episode of a cartoon existed or not? It was such a bizarre concept to me back in 2015, besides the show unlocking a memory for me in the first place, and getting me to revisit 90s and 2000s content I hadn't thought about in a decade at that point. The entirety of the search was really about trying to prove or disprove the episode's existence, and that got me to look back through old fan sites, interact with old fans of the series, and dig deep through any mentions online of episode 29 that were left in comments or forums from back in the day, which was actually really fun to do. In those days, you didn't really know what was real or what was fake when it came to lost content, especially that of an obscure 90s show without any home media releases, so it definitely emitted that treasure hunter experience. But like I said before, this real or fake mystery was really the only driving force behind its intrigue. In fact, its companion lost episodes, Just Chillin' and Kafun, were equally as lost as episode 29 was rumored to be. But those never gained anywhere near as much attention because they were actually confirmed to exist. So without that specific part of the mystery, I don't think I or anyone else would have cared about this episode as much as we did. And nowadays it's the kind of thing that would not gain any attention, as the narrative about it being a lost episode that no one had seen that only aired once has been played out time and time again. At the time I was determined to prove that it did exist, and that the claims online about it were real, because I really wanted to prove the doubters wrong. But through more searching and gaining insight from longtime fans, it definitely changed my perspective to the point where there were explanations for how this false rumor was formed and passed around in the first place. And then after jumping camps to that of believing the episode did not exist, the series creator eventually debunked the rumor himself years later and put an end to the search entirely. If you've been watching my channel for many years, then you know exactly what this next topic is, and I could not leave it out of a list like this. In those same interviews where I get asked what got me into lost media, I'm usually asked about what my favorite topic or search is, and Kappa Mikey is one that always gets brought up. I think in terms of nostalgia alone and the memories I have with the topic, it will always be number 1 in my heart. But within the credentials for this video, I'm going to place it at number 4. Specifically, the search for this piece of lost media was the Kappa Mikey MTV pilot, the first ever real lost media search I went on by myself. I say it that way because in contrast to Kablam, not only did we know this pilot actually existed, we had screenshots showing what it looked like. And the creator himself confirmed that he did not have a copy, making it a better example of a finished product that went missing. I can't even remember exactly how I came across the topic. It must have been during one of my old browsing articles sessions from back in the day, and seeing the name of the show unlocked a memory for me. But it was also the intrigue of its earlier art style that pulled me in too. The final show was a short-lived cartoon that aired on Nickelodeon and some of its other channels, while this original version was pitched to MTV and was said to be more adult in its humor and style. Even the drawings here look a little rougher than that of the final product on Nick. I always loved the storyline of a kid show originally being made for a different audience. And mixed with the 2000s nostalgia, I had to find it and really wanted to see it for myself. And that want to find it became one of my first obsessions with lost media, back in an era when everything felt more creepy and unsettling in the context of searching for missing content. I'm sure some of you guys out there remember that era where everyone had cartoon characters with black eyes and blood dripping from them in their thumbnails. It felt uncomfortable knowing that a piece of media like this was made and exists, yet just fell out into the atmosphere somewhere, without anyone having a tangible copy of it. I remember spending those long nights on the computer, scouring the internet for crew members or email addresses, not wanting to go to bed until I made a certain amount of progress with the search. And because of this intense work ethic, doing it completely on my own, I had also developed some early methods of contacting people, like using LinkedIn and finding personal blogs from other websites of crew members who had moved on to other projects. It really laid the groundwork for what searching for lost media would become for me. And if I remember correctly, the video about the search that I made became a cornerstone of how I formatted my lost media videos, and was one of my first big successes in that early era. Nobody was doing individual search efforts, which is partially why I think my channel gained as much attention as it did. And what made it even more perfect was that it was actually found 8 months later. The director of the series found a copy on his hard drive and the search actually ended. I think this also might have been one of the earliest examples of a found media video, at least one that I made. I'm not sure how many people were doing found media videos back then, but I felt like I needed to conclude the bigger topics with dedicated ones for them. I remember news of the find also made the rounds in some animation circles, and this to me was also the beginning of the golden age of lost pilots. Johnny Quasar, Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi, Meso Blues, and so many other similar topics first gained popularity and attention back then. While lost pilot searches are still a thing nowadays, I find that the general interest in them has dipped considerably from the mid-2010s era, and the intrigue people have with them feels much quicker and more disposable than the higher praise they used to garner, when the space that lost media occupied was much smaller. But speaking of lost pilots, and perhaps this better proves my point with their intrigue in those days, I'm giving the third best lost media search spot to one that I usually always bring up alongside Kappa Mikey, at least to you guys on YouTube. Telling the whole story of how I debunked a lost Ed and Eddie pilot claim that was passed around in a defunct community for a decade that didn't actually exist is a little more complicated and confusing. Yes, third place goes to none other than the fittingly named Three Men pilot, a one-of-a-kind topic that to this day, I don't think I have ever quite come across again. Now this one might need a little explanation, as there are a few more layers to it than both Kablam and Kappa Mikey. Perhaps you could say it's a fusion of the two. So this is one I remember came from the Lost Media Wiki forums in like 2017 or 2018, before the forums really took off like they would post-2020. In one of those threads, a user recollects a more adult version of Ed, Ed and Eddie that was allegedly pitched to Comedy Central before Cartoon Network picked it up. And similar to the Kablam rumor, this one was accompanied by details about the characters and plot in this earlier iteration. But unlike episode 29, where the content was said to have been made, then never aired, this concept would have never been intended to air, because it would have been pitched to network executives, which means the average person would not have come across it on their own. This, combined with the fact that there were no visuals or any real leads that could point towards finding content from this, even if it did exist, It added more credibility to the story, like it was so rare that's why you've never heard or seen it before. But the question remained unclear about whether or not it was real, as the thread proposed possibilities on each side. It actually garnered quite a lot of discussion. I believe that's why I actually took interest in the topic at all, was because there were some solid ideas being passed back and forth about it. So after having been involved in a handful of searches up to that point, I took on the challenge to prove if it was real or just a rumor. I was going into the search much more objectively. With Kablam, I was already convinced it kinda was real before I even started looking into it, so it became more difficult to accept information that disagreed with the conclusion in my head. But for 3 Men, I wanted an unbiased answer. The only problem with this is that there was no real starting point to search from. 3 Men just didn't seem to exist on the modern internet. And that's when the search went from 0 to 100, and I immersed myself in Ed, and Eddie knowledge. In doing some initial searching, I happened to find a directory that listed a plethora of both active and defunct fan sites that spanned around a decade of content, some even earlier than that. This blew my mind and got me to dig through all of these old, archaic fan sites of literally just content. Lots and lots of content from a cartoon that had ended like a decade before. I could not believe the amount of discussion this show garnered, especially considering I just never saw anything like this for any other cartoon I looked into. It wasn't just an exercise in lost media, but a real visualization that the internet is losing content all the time, and many spaces are left to simply rot away. To me, that was always the bigger takeaway from this search. It wasn't just about reading a comment on a fandom page from 2 years before, it was going through a digital archive nobody had looked at in a decade, from fans who would have lived through this era when the rumor was passed around. And that got me to actually join and reach out to some of these old groups and inquire directly to them, the primary sources, about whether or not this topic was actually real. It was almost like a high, gathering information from all sorts of different people and concluding my findings with a massive report on the forums, where I deduced the pilot never actually existed. Once again, this is something you could look at nowadays and say it was so obviously fake, why did you waste time searching for it? But at the time there was a greater sense of the unknown, and presenting my conclusion in this way, after an 18-hour search, was met with a lot of appreciation, and is what finally closed the topic. It didn't end because people decided it was dumb and the thread should be locked. It ended because there was evidence to back up the conclusion, and I will always remember the lengths I went to get there. The next topic coming in at number 2 might be a surprise to some of you guys, because it's not really a traditional piece of lost media, or even an iconic topic from within the community itself. That's the mystery of the Super Game Boy 2 peripheral. But the reason for why I placed it so high on the list is because it truly was a game changer for my own growth as a content creator. Unlike the previous topics we've looked at so far, this one was actually all mapped out, its research process planned over the course of several months, and then the actual release of the video garnered new heights that I think solidified my dedication to the scene. I'm still surprised at how many people have told me in the past, and still tell me, this was the topic that got them into my channel and lost media in general. And for a long time, I had never really considered it to be a key video like that. I suppose a photo or picture is what I wanted to find at its conclusion, but basically it was a search for a physical item. One of the first of its kind for the era, because I don't think it was until a couple years later when all those Kelly toy and plush mysteries really started taking off. So yeah, the Super Game Boy was a peripheral for the Super Famicom and Super Nintendo that allowed you to play handheld games on a TV. The first version, which is gray in color, released in both Japan and the US. However, the upgraded second version, called the Super Game Boy 2, was blue in color and released only in Japan. Allegedly. According to rumors, which spanned as far as actual publications, so it was not just online commenters spreading rumors back in the day, the blue Japanese version apparently had a very limited rare US release that had never been documented or seen before. So the recurring question is asked once again, did it actually exist? But it's not so simple, because the craziest thing about this topic, compared to any other does it exist type story, is that there was way more evidence that suggested a release did happen. I was able to navigate through old Nintendo fan sites on the Wayback Machine and come across time-accurate primary sources from fans and collectors back then who had either heard of the peripheral's existence or heard about its upcoming release. This is something I had not encountered with lost media up to that point. Most unverified rumors always lean towards false, but this one seemed to be true, or at least was based on some kind of fact. Something else that threw the topic in an unexpected direction was a very specific and consistent claim that the US Super Game Boy 2 units were sold exclusively through QVC, which would mean there has to be some kind of record or data that exists depicting them there, but none had been found. At the time, this did lead me to the conclusion that their whole existence was a false memory or simply a fake rumor, and my original video did end with that consensus. But then years later, a new theory came forward about them. I was actually very happy to come across this new discussion a few years ago, which crafted a new theory that states it's possible QVC did sell Super Game Boy 2 units, with the exception that they were Japanese boards inside of US shells. This would allow for the peripheral to be inserted and work on US consoles, but this would not make them an official release from Nintendo. This story sounds really plausible and could explain why so many people remember seeing them or hearing about them back in the day. But still, to this day, I have yet to find any listings or records from QVC that definitively show this, meaning the debate is technically still ongoing. And if anything, just the fact that a story which was believed to be false could actually be true in a way that nobody really expected adds to the overall intrigue and cool factor that such a niche topic like this has. Not to mention in a greater area of lost video game content for how extensive archives and records have been kept from video game preservationists. And finally, what is the topic that I consider to be my all-time greatest search? I think depending on who is watching this video, there might be some disagreement in the comments about this one. But when picking number one, I had to consider what topic kept me into lost media, had the greatest impact on me, and further established the community as a legitimate subculture. I could not pick a better contender that fits all of this criteria for me than A Day with SpongeBob. I talk about this topic every now and then on the channel, basically since the beginning of my lost media videos, but damn do I always go back to this topic when I'm feeling nostalgic for the old days. I don't think it even needs any introduction, but this is quite a contrast to how the topic started out originally. At the time though, in early 2015, before the topic blew up like it did, there were like 4 people, including myself, who even cared about it at all. We actually thought it was a completed movie and was lost in the traditional sense. We had tried looking for physical DVDs for quite a while, until it became more clear that it was never made months later. In fact, to this day, that's one of my biggest regrets when it comes to making lost media videos. I never made a video on A Day with SpongeBob in my old original style. I remember first coming across the article on the old wiki in like March or April of that year, around the time I was looking into the Kablam stuff, and almost talked about it because the cover was so strange looking. But unfortunately, there was just not enough information to work with at the time, so a script would have been too hard to write. It just never happened. But I do remember telling my brother about the topic and some online friends who had no idea what lost media was at the time. But aside from the timeline and search process, which I know you guys all know by now, what really stands out for me with this movie is how it affected my interest in the lost media community itself. I think if you ask anyone what their favorite piece of lost media is, in some way, their choice will be made with nostalgia in mind, or with the experience they had related to the topic, not necessarily the larger body of media it comes from. Yeah, I do love SpongeBob Lost Media quite a lot, but this same movie could have been A Day with Mario or A Day with Naruto, and it was the takeaway of collaborating with other people that I will always remember. This topic forced me to work closely with other people for the first time, something I had never done and didn't really want to do back in those days, because everything was still so new, and I was new to the scene. But because of that, it created some of the earliest memories I have with collaboration efforts and meeting people through a search that would eventually end up becoming my friends. That old Skype group, which is probably lost media in itself now, and then the spin-off group when people got mad at each other and formed a new one, and then the super secret group which excluded a different set of people, were all blasts to be a part of. It was a learning experience in an area of a community I was discovering for the first time, and that's something else entirely that makes it feel so special too. At the height of the search's popularity, I was still a complete unknown in the community. I had made those few lost media videos over the spring and summer of that year, but it was way before JBVO, the Purple Yoshi Tech Demo, Hannah Montana Anime, the stuff my channel became known for. So in this way, I was just doing this because it was interesting to me, and it was just fun. I will always say that's what kept me in the community in the first place. I'm sure I would have kept making lost media videos if it hadn't been for this topic, but there's a higher chance I would have either gone back to more gaming-styled content or just focused on game beta stuff, as I felt like that was always competing with cartoon lost media for me at the time. Heck, looking back, I don't think I even really contributed that much to the search, because I was so bad at it back then. I was mostly just there to give moral support and offer my opinions. In fact, I probably spent too much time in that group chat by the end. I had become obsessed just waiting for any drop of news for the day. And now, taking all of this into account in the modern day, the wonderful irony about the topic is that 10 years later, almost everything I recollected just now has changed. Most to all of the people who were in those group chats are either gone or don't do anything with lost media now. Topics like A Day with SpongeBob would never gain this much interest because it's one of those so obviously fake topics that those who were not there to experience it label it as. And lost media in general doesn't feel fun in the same way that it used to, at least in my eyes. But I would like to think as the community does continue to evolve and grow over time, there will be new topics to research that evoke that same magical feeling. With the thousands and thousands of new lost media searches that pop up, you never know which one will become your next memory. And perhaps that's why some of us are still here even a decade later.
A true ninja always stays on top of their training, just as a true viewer stays up to date with the latest videos. So, why not grab another cup of green tea and watch some more? I'd stick around this digital dimension myself, but I gotta get back to my teammates. See you in the next chapter.